Stop it. Get some help.
So I've given hints that I'm working on something akin to a story writing and comic making, and if you want more details about it, I suggest you go to my Discord server that's in my description, since I have a channel dedicated to it. Now, why did I start this off talking about my own work and writing?
Because you're a shill.
Well, when it comes to writing, there are things you need to look out for in the process of it. And one of those things are plot holes in your story. That isn't to say you have to show everything on screen, since you can easily explain things later in the story, but plot holes are an issue in writing. So, what is a plot hole?
Space is warped and time is bendable.
Well, there are a number of definitions, but consensus deems it to be a gap in the story's logic. It would break the rules that the series itself set. That isn't to say that they can make or break an experience, especially since there are different kinds of plot holes, and some plot holes don't necessarily matter. Now that we've gotten that out of the way, let's talk about the subject of today's video, Patrick H. Willems.
Movies tend to assume that the audience is reasonably intelligent, but I guess they're wrong.
Someone who decided to put out a video talking about plot holes and how people should shut up about plot holes. To the point where he wants to...
Plot holes used to be this thing that only existed in super nerdy movie conversations. Like, hey, how did Indiana Jones survive clinging to the outside of that submarine? But over the past 15 years, they've become pervasive, spreading through online movie conversations. Everywhere you turn, people are complaining about...
That's not really something new. We live in the age of the internet, where information and discussion are a lot more easily accessible and possible. And really, despite what you say, if you don't want to see people talking about plot holes, then you don't need to watch that stuff or read the forum posts. It's not as persuasive as you make it out to be, but even then, consider this. These are reviewers. Reviewers and people who talk about films more specifically tend to worry more about other features or aspects about a movie, such as presentation, the execution, and the overall flow of the story's plot. And if there is a plot hole that breaks the flow, hence why it seems it's a problem to them.
Biggest plot holes.
Plot holes.
Plot holes.
Plot holes.
Plot holes.
All the plot holes. Plot holes. Plot holes.
So full of plot holes.
Plot hole.
Naruto plot holes.
So many plot holes.
Plot holes. 10 movie plot holes.
Oh no, you cherry-picked several instances where people are complaining about plot holes without actually giving context to why they think they are plot holes and whether or not if they're valid. No. I get this was a way to set up to illustrate your point, but considering that later in this video we get a sign of some...
In my head, I'd be scratching while my thoughts were busy hatching if I only had a brain.
Anyway, let's continue with the fallacy points, since this is also a form of poisoning the well. Mr. Cool Shades here is attempting to spin the idea that plot holes are harped on so much. Also, let's consider the fact you decided to pull a Matthew Patrick and not list these sources. For all I know, these complaints could be valid. They could not be valid. I don't know.
You don't know yet!
Otherwise, we're just gonna have to take your word and, nope.
Back in April, when A Quiet Place opened, my Twitter and Facebook feeds were filled with people complaining about all the plot holes. I saw one guy say he'd made a list of 41 plot holes in that movie. But here's the thing. No one seems to actually know what a plot hole is.
Oh boy, gotta love that condescending attitude. In addition, I love how you're bringing up The Quiet Place here as an example and lists someone who brought up about plot holes. 41, right? You don't bother to show us any actual proof of this being a thing. For all I know, these people don't exist and you don't even give enough information to work off to find it. Then we've got the whole people don't know what plot holes are. While I do agree that some people do overuse the word plot hole, the proper way to go about this is to actually give examples of what people do say and not create straw men. Show us what these people are claiming to be plot holes and that people are actually making these claims. Considering that you do actually go on to give specific examples later, this raises a rather interesting bit of inconsistency since you're willing to provide specific examples later, but not now. And to top it off, you're about to give your own definition of what a plot hole is, but that doesn't mean that people will agree with that definition or are using such a broad term for plot hole. Because guess what? In some circles, there are varying types of plot holes. For example, and I'll link the article talking about it, and I might make a video on it because this is actually an interesting topic to talk about, there are MacGuffin plot holes, logic plot holes, character plot holes, narrative plot holes, and Deus Ex Machina plot holes. Each have their own uniqueness to them, and oftentimes people will refer to them. That isn't to say that there are the only kinds of plot holes, but there are more nuance in assuming that people don't know what plot holes are, and being too vague in general about isn't going to be healthy for your argument.
And all those plot holes people complain about? they don't actually matter.
Again, being generalized and vague. Way to paint everyone with a broad stroke there, buddy. The thing is, like I said before, with some plot holes don't matter, but some do. The problem is the context. With a lack of context on what's being specifically said by people, this comes off as
Cheeseburger Doyle! Drive it on!
He does give specific, and I use that word loosely, examples, but without actually providing that people making these claims, that's an issue.
So, what is a plot hole? People's definitions vary, but here's the generally accepted one that I use. A plot hole is a point in which a story breaks a previously established rule about its own universe. Basically, it's when a story contradicts itself.
Because you're going with this specific example, you close yourself off to the many possibilities of different types of plot holes that people can make. Cause, guess what, boys and girls? Plot holes aren't just about contradictions. They can also include missing elements in a story, and with going with generalized terminology, and one that doesn't really have any actual backing to it by popular consensus, this allows Mr. Willems to use his subjective stance to manipulate the arguments to his favor. Heck, even Wikipedia would have been something to use the basis off of, since guess what? Their article actually talks about gaps in the storyline.
Okay, so here's what are not plot holes.
In The Dark Knight Rises, we never see how Batman gets back to Gotham City. That's a plot hole.
Yeesh, and I thought I was rough with straw men. This is what I was referring to earlier. Instead of providing an actual example of someone saying this, you got Mr. Strawman here making the complaint. If these complaints were so overblown on the internet, then finding a review or few shouldn't be hard to find an actual example of.
One of the earliest cinematic developments was the concept of montage. The idea is that when two images are presented in sequence, the audience understands that they occur chronologically and will mentally fill in the time between scenes. So for instance, if a person is in one location and the next scene they're in another location, we understand that in between scenes they traveled between the locations. Movies tend to assume that the audience is reasonably intelligent, but I guess they're wrong.
Oh, so now you're a detective, eh, Captain Emo?
Is there like a rule you have to be a smug jerk when you're talking about movies on the internet? Because if we take your straw man's argument...
In The Dark Knight Rises, we never see how Batman gets back to Gotham City. That's a plot hole.
You do realize that the issue isn't with the montage, but rather how Batman actually managed to get back to Gotham. Cause at this point in the movie, Bruce Wayne has nothing. He's pretty much down and out. Montage doesn't really explain how he got back because he doesn't have the money and doesn't have the funding to get back. And congrats, you have given an example that doesn't work. And it makes you come off as an elitist and an idiot because your example is wrong.
If movies showed us every single second that happened during the span of the story, they would be 40 hours long and really f***ing boring.
But who's requesting that, though?
In my head, I'd be scratching while my thoughts were busy hatching if I only had a brain.
Yes, that clip is going to be prevalent. Oh boy, get the liquor!
There are so many plot holes in A Quiet Place. Oh, it's such a great movie. I mean, like, why did they decide to have a baby? And why didn't they just move to the waterfall?
Oh, this is the one that really drives me nuts. Movies are, for the most part, about human beings, or at least characters who think and act like human beings. And you know what human beings are not? Logical. People are impulsive. They make choices based on emotion. Not everyone thinks exactly the same.
Says the guy who's trying to make a logical argument. I guess you're not human. Regardless of the invasion of fluffballs, humans may be creatures of emotions, but considering your own example, where the characters in A Quiet Place are actively trying to use their common sense and logic, the fact that they didn't take advantage of the waterfall or refrain from using the quiet room down below, all the while doing things like eating soft food or using fabric on a game board, goes against the whole they're not using logic. The fact that the characters in A Quiet Place are not using their emotions to make their decisions makes their choices to not use the waterfall as their actual place of refuge as a big issue. But no, just brush off these criticisms. Who cares? We've got an agenda to complain about. Also, people don't think logically in movies. The cast of The Thing would like to have a word with you.
And also, people make mistakes. You know how in Star Trek, Vulcans live dominated by logic, and it's established that acting logically is at odds with acting human. So if everyone acted totally logically all the time, only making the most logical decision in any situation, no one would be acting human. Thus, there would be no conflict, which would lead to no drama, which would lead to no stories. And movies would be really f***ing boring.
Warning! Warning!
Bullshitter alert!
Without the proper context, guess what? This does not work. Again, thanks to your vagueness to the max. Do emotions take over people's logic? Yes. But there are a lot of other factors that you're not taking into account because guess what? It takes two to tango, and we'll be getting to that to another point, but I'll say right now that characters can still be all logical, but that wouldn't kill any tension or conflict.
There is a huge plot hole in Star Wars. I mean, come on. Why would the Death Star have such an obvious design flaw?
Okay, some of these can be valid complaints.
Wait a minute! What?
Final bend.
There's a little bit of text on his side that says the Death Star complaint isn't valid, despite him using this as a main example, and he doesn't debunk how this isn't a valid example whatsoever. This isn't only contradictory in nature, but the worst thing I have ever seen lately considering how this video is supposed to be informative. Thanks for not telling us why it's not valid.
Like in the 2009 Star Trek, Kirk just happens to get stranded on the same planet as old Spock, and they end up in the same cave together so Spock can explain what's going on. I like the movie, but that's a little contrived and lazy. But it's not a plot hole.
And who's saying that it is?
I mean, how does Benicio del Toro know the rebels' plans? Nobody told him. That's a plot hole.
At least 50% of the plot holes that I see people complain about are things that are actually explained in the movie if you just pay attention. Like that one in The Last Jedi, there's a scene where you see DJ listening as Poe tells Finn and Rose the Resistance's plan. But I guess if you're too busy live tweeting about plot holes, you can miss some stuff.
That's the most selfish, egotistical thing I've ever heard. Thank you.
Really, at this point, a lot of what I can say is 1, you're generalizing, 2, you're not providing anyone who's actually saying this stuff, and 3, you're a smug elitist who should be on the receiving end of those punches. So in order to make sure I'm not being redundant, enjoy some random clips from here on out with a counter gag.
If you want, you can find plot holes anywhere. They're all over your favorite movies. In Lord of the Rings, the Eagles could have just flown the ring to Mount Doom and saved everyone all that trouble.
You do realize this isn't a plot hole, right? Giant eagles with the Eye of Sauron to shoot down? If anything, this is more of a gag on the whole fact that they were overusing the eagles in the films.
In Toy Story, why does Buzz freeze like the other toys when he thinks he's a real person?
To blend in with Woody and the others, given how Andy looks so different from Buzz and the others, I mean, not to mention that Andy's so much larger, he probably thinks Andy is an alien and is covering it.
In Ocean's 11, how did they get the flyers into the vault? In Cinderella, why does the glass slipper stay when everything else disappears? In Alien, if the acid can melt through the floor, why doesn't it melt through the entire ship?
Because the acid in Aliens does not eat through the whole ship because of chemistry. The acid encounters the different substances on the floor, paint, carpeting, insulation, etc. It reacts, and as it reacts, it consumes the ability of the acid to react. If you had an infinite amount of acid, yes, it would eat through the whole ship, but this is a finite amount and not a plot hole.
In Gremlins, what does after midnight technically mean? Isn't it always after midnight? How does that rule make any sense? In Star Wars, why does the Death Star have a trash compactor when they can just jettison the trash into space?
A lot of these aren't even plot holes! What are you going on about?
Look, if you want to watch stuff this way, you can even find plot holes in this video. Why am I wearing sunglasses if I'm inside? I'm indoors in one shot and outdoors in the next, but we never see me go outside. Plot hole.
Well, although to be actually serious, dude, what you described yourself isn't a plot hole. You wearing sunglasses or not, it's you changing characters. Although with your lack of understanding of narrative, despite being a professional, I suppose it's easier to slather anything in the name of plot holes. You don't have an actual story going on, therefore you don't have a plot, therefore you don't have a plot hole.
You can find plot holes or logic gaps in any movie, and if you want to, go right ahead. Just don't tell me that those are genuine flaws and problems and reasons that a movie is bad, because they're not. None of these things actually matter, because they're not what a movie is about. So even though most people are using the term plot hole incorrectly, all of these complaints are rooted in the same thing.
You're a fucking idiot.
First off, when your own examples work against you, I'm sorry, but if someone's not using the term correctly, it would be you. Secondly, yes, plot holes can be an issue. However, it's a very subjective issue. Not everyone's suspension of disbelief is the same, and these issues may or may not be an issue. Honestly, it depends on the person. From what you're saying and from what I can gather from this video, you yourself seem to have a pretty high tolerance to what you can get past in films. My issue is that you're using your own standards to tell people what they shouldn't care about in this, and you know what? I'd actually agree with you that people do take films and such a bit too seriously. seriously. But what leads into my third point is the fact that this ego of yours is setting too much of a standard of what criticism should be. You've yet to provide any actual critiques made by people, and instead allowing your straw men and anecdotal accounts to act as evidence in this, when this is the dumbest move you can do in this sort of aspect in an argument. And finally, yes! They can be genuine flaws in a movie, because apparently Mr. Professional here doesn't understand that there's flaws in writing. They can be legitimate flaws. This goes back to my previous statement about suspensions of disbelief, but really depending on the person's standards, if there are enough plot holes or such like that in the film, then to that person, they can see it as a bad film. And guess what? You know what a movie is about? It can be about a lot of things. It can be about entertainment. It can be about fun. It can be about a story. And guess what? If a story has plot holes in it, it can actually ruin it. Again, this is all subjective, and some people are more than likely to disagree with me. The difference here is, I'm not dismissing opinions that might be brought up.
But movies aren't about logic. They're not equations, they're not proofs, they're not puzzles.
Well, someone's never seen a mystery movie before.
Movies are not math. Remember that guy in your freshman dorm who would always try to guess the endings of movies so that he could prove that he was smarter than the people who made them? Well, now everyone is turning into that guy.
I know, I'm looking at the guy right now.
Movies tend to assume that the audience is reasonably intelligent, but I guess they're wrong.
You're talking out loud, you know.
On the site movieplotholes.com, there are 7 plot holes listed for Die Hard. The first one says that the villain's plan is to stage a hostage situation so that the police will shut down power to the building, allowing them to access the vault. But since they would have already had detailed plans of the building, they could have just shut down power themselves, making the whole thing more simple. Now, I know it seems impossible to watch movies wrong, but you're watching movies wrong.
So, the one time you give an actual example of someone giving an example of a plot hole, which, by the way, is the point of the site, to find plot holes and showcase them, meaning that they're paying attention to the movie, instead of actually trying to debunk the claim, which, guess what, you can, you decide to sidestep the entire thing and address something completely different that has nothing to do with it, and assume that the person who wrote this critique, well, not even a critique, it's just listing plot holes.
Die Hard is a movie about an ordinary man thrown into an impossible situation, who needs to rise to the occasion and persevere so that he can reunite with his estranged wife. That's the point of the movie. That's what it's about. Most of the other plot holes for Die Hard listed on the site are variations on, why didn't John McClane do this? Well, because the whole point of John McClane is that he's a normal guy who makes human mistakes.
And to address the whole, you're watching movies wrong, not only is that a grade A egotism, but now you're saying there's a wrong way to enjoy films. What if that person enjoys dissecting and talking about plot holes? And you know what's even sadder? You actually could have had a decent point here, because there are issues with the plot holes listed in this article. One of the plot holes reads as follows. Even though the actions in the film took place in 1988, cell phones were already available back then. Why didn't anybody attempt to call out? Why didn't John McClane look for any while walking free in the building? Clearly, the author of this article doesn't know their cell phone history because there are actually a few factors here. 1. Cell phones during that time were huge, and I'm not talking in popularity. I'm talking about an actual size. These things weren't exactly what you could call pocket portable, especially when they are about 28 ounces heavy, and are not exactly that subtle either. If anyone attempted to use one of these things, then it would be way too obvious that the hostages were trying to call out for help, and that would be bad because the terrorists would shoot them. 2. That's assuming that they'd even have these back in 1988. You know how much one of these things cost? $2,500. This thing was a luxury item and not something that many people would actively be buying. And 3rd, that's not even taking into the fact that during 1988, only 800,000 of these cell phones were in use. And considering that the population of the United States at the time, according to the census, was about over 240 million people, we're looking at not even 1% of the United States having one of these things. Heck, even with your own example to your point, you could have proven that this wasn't a plot hole, because it's explained in the movie that the circuits cannot be cut locally and has to be called in and approved. Once again, you could have proven your point that these were not plot holes!
If he did the perfect, most logical thing every single time, he wouldn't be the same character. He'd basically be a Vulcan, and the movie would end way earlier and be terrible.
Not really, because even if you have the most logical plan, you wouldn't be able to take into account the other factors, such as the terrorists. They're the unknown factor in all this, since unless you have the ability to control people, you're not going to be able to accurately predict your enemy's movements unless that's your character's skill.
Again, if you think this is a plot hole, or you're annoyed because of the logic here, You're kinda watching movies wrong.
Cocaine's a hell of a drug.
There's an episode of the show Community that imagines what a horror movie would look like if all the characters only made totally logical decisions.
Should we go check it out?
No. We should call 911 on my fully charged cell phone, lock the doors, and then stand back to back in the middle of the room holding knives.
And the conclusion is that it would be really boring.
No, it wouldn't have been. Because you know what factors these people and you apparently are forgetting? The antagonists. Since this example only counts the protagonist's decisions, because really, it's possible to have a movie where the characters do make logical decisions and can still be defeated because the antagonists can easily just be as smart as the characters and logical. Heck, in this example, I can think of ways for this to work. Make one of the two characters be the actual killer. Have the antagonist be tech-savvy and have a way to block calls, since there are ways to do it. Legally, too. Or have a magical element in there. There are way too many factors that could be taken into account, and this example doesn't really help your case.
I am in no way telling you to turn your brain off or to not think critically about movies. Not at all. Again, if you think this is a plot hole, or you're annoyed because of the logic here, you're kinda watching movies wrong. I'm saying you should worry about the things that actually matter.
In your subjective opinion. You do realize that when it comes to media, people can stress the importance of varying things because of that subjectivity, right? Because apparently you don't care about the logic of a story. Doesn't mean that other people feel the same way.
So... But those aren't the real problems with the movie. The actual problems are that many of the central characters are totally static and poorly motivated, and they don't learn anything or grow through the story, and the one major moment of growth is caused by a ridiculous plot contrivance. So as much as I enjoy making fun of some dumb logic gaps in that movie, they still don't really matter.
The plot holes, remember the plot holes? So you're trying to tell me the supremacy, Snoke's ship, isn't powerful enough to penetrate the shields.
In episode 2F09, when Ichi plays Scratchy's skeleton like a xylophone, he strikes the same rib twice in succession, yet he produces two clearly different tones.
Why is it that in the 80s or 90s or early 2000s, no one really cared about plot holes? They still existed, but no one ever complained a movie was bad because of all the plot holes. So what happened? Basically, the internet. Because I like driving myself insane, I searched back through Google year by year for references to plot holes. Until about 2007, they only appeared in movie reviews and forum posts. They hadn't gone fully mainstream yet. They hadn't been embraced by the public.
And your evidence doesn't prove that. Seriously, due to the fact that the internet wasn't as prominent as it is today back then, and how people often, had to talk to other people's faces, and not through a screen, there's no evidence to support that the plot holes weren't being discussed regularly. That being said, I can't claim my half to be true either. But again, the difference is I'm acknowledging that this isn't proof. Meanwhile, Mr. Shades here thinks that a simple montage of Google is enough to justify his point.
Nitpicks about popular things that could reveal things readers may have missed. But 2012 was where the change really happened. This was when plot holes started taking over YouTube. Pop culture commentary from a nerdy fan perspective began exploding in popularity. And immediately, the types of videos that proved most popular were humorous analyses of popular movies focusing on surface-level nitpicks. And over the next several years, these types of videos grew in number and popularity. For many people, especially millennials and whatever the generation after millennials is called, most film criticism they consume is on YouTube. And not all, but a lot of this is surface-level critique, focusing on nitpicks, and chief among those nitpicks, plot holes. Plot holes don't really mean anything, but they're good clickbait, and those videos get views, and they multiply.
We get it! CinemaSins is trash!
And people watch them and believe them and repeat those points in conversation. And when they watch movies, they think about these surface-level nitpicks. They look for them. No one is really to blame for this. Okay, CinemaSins definitely deserves some of the blame.
Gee, I couldn't tell!
But it's not just them. This is way bigger. This is about cultural shifts coinciding with evolving technology. And look, as long as movies are popular and people on the internet are making videos for clicks, it's going to keep happening. So look, watch whatever YouTube videos you want, think whatever you want about movies, just please.
Look, the rest of the video isn't worth commentating on since he's thanking people and shilling his merchandise for about 2.5 minutes. Because really, what's the best way to cap this kind of train wreck off of? Look, if you don't think plot holes are a big deal, that's fine. It's subjective. It's a subjective stance that I've been saying, but the moment you disregard other people's opinions, well, not even that, when you don't even address their own opinions and actually mock them for it, I'm sorry, but who died and made you the arbiter of film criticism? So I hope you enjoyed being elitist with this. In any case, I'm Skullcommon, and remember to examine your fandom.
La 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 la.